Welcome everyone to the 11th Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting, otherwise known as Dpic. We have a full yet focused agenda for you today. Before we dive into the agenda though, I do want to take a step back in time to the first Dpic meeting in 2014. April 9, 2014, we were in a severe drought. The concept of one Delta, one science was nascent, and there were few ecosystem restoration projects on the books or being completed. Today, we have the fourth largest snowpack on record, which instead of drought could mean flood. We're moving forward on the science action agenda. We've just updated the Delta Plan, and we have on the books ecosystem projects that have permits or are breaking ground, more ecosystem restoration projects in the last year than in the previous 10. So that says to me that Dpic is a powerhouse of collaboration. We've managed to get focused and get quite a bit done, and I hope it continues. So on that note, I'd like each of us here at the table to take a minute, introduce yourselves, and since there are so many of us, let's take just 60 seconds for any activity that you'd like to share with the Dpic members. And I'll start with Wade Crowfoot.
Great. Thanks so much. I'm really excited to be here. I'm Wade Crowfoot, and I serve as Secretary of the California Natural Resources Agency. And I'm really encouraged and energized by the progress in the Delta over the past several years. Susan outlined it well. More is happening as it relates to restoration in the Delta than it has in a very long time. As I understand it, Dpic has facilitated collaboration and coordination among federal, state, and local agencies in a way that really hasn't happened, and that we're all prioritizing work in the Delta, recognizing the unique place that it is. I come from the Bay Area, and I've lived in the Bay Area for the last 15, 20 years. In that time, I've had a really good opportunity to be in the Delta, primarily recreating in the Delta before I was in government, but then also increasingly working in the Delta and working on Delta issues. I spent 5 years in the Brown administration helping navigate our administration through the drought and really appreciated developing strong partnerships with many of the agencies around the table and many of the communities in the Delta as well. And then I would just say, all the work we do recognizes the Delta is a unique place because of its communities, because of its agriculture, and of course because of its biodiversity and role as an essential habitat. So as we move this work forward, I keep all of those priorities top of mind, and I'm just excited to continue to make progress together.
Thank you. My name is Joaquin Esquivel. I'm chair of the State Water Resources Control Board. And, it's when we talk about collaboration, when we talk about getting to the table and being able to attack our most wicked challenges, certainly the Delta is that place and can easily become sort of a way we pay lip service to the idea of collaboration, but it's about the relationships. And so looking across the table here, I'm fortunate to certainly serve as chair of the board, but also ready and excited to be able to continue to advance the relationships that we all here have at this table and continue to address what certainly for my board is a significant amount of our workload as we update the water quality control plan and continue to figure out how do we best piece together what is a very challenging and wicked issue when we talk about the decline of the Delta and its impact on communities and people. So thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Oscar Villegas, Yolo County Supervisor representing District 1, which is West Sacramento and Clarksburg, but also I also serve as chair of the Delta Protection Commission, and that finds me on the Delta Stewardship Council, which finds me here today with all of you. And so, Madam Chair, I appreciate you mentioning the 2014 challenges that we had. Shortly after I got on the Board of Supervisors in February of 2014, my very first meeting in the Delta was in large part meeting with farmers and DWR talking about curtailments. And you can imagine talking to farmers about water curtailments in the midst of a drought is a very challenging conversation. So here we find ourselves fourth largest snowpack on record. So it gives us an opportunity to actually think a little bit differently about policy and the opportunity to be more collaborative, necessarily challenged with the drought concerns, but now an opportunity to make some good of it. So I'm happy to be here.
Hello, my name is Dave Mooney. I manage the Bay Delta office for the Bureau of Reclamation. We're very involved with our state and federal partners and our local partners on how we operate the Central Valley project in coordination with most of the folks around this table. We're working pretty diligently on the reinitiation of consultation for the operation of the state and federal water projects, as well as working with our state partners on how we move forward in the Water Quality Control Plan update, as well as a number of our ecosystem and science activities that are very important for how we improve our way forward. So excited to hear the topics on the agenda today.
Hi, I'm Clyde McDonald. Sneaky trick. I'm Clyde McDonald. I'm on the State Central Valley Flood Protection Board. We are responsible for what are called the project levees in the Central Valley. We work with the Department of Water Resources and the Corps of Engineers, and with a lot of local agencies as well. And well, our big focus, I think, probably for the next couple of years is going to be on improving maintenance at the local level, also the state level. We have a lot of levees that are not being maintained to standards, and the federal government sets the standards. They're our federal partner, but so we're going to be working on that. So thank you. And handling a heavy water year.
Hi, I'm Brooke Jacobs here with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the department also looks forward to continuing to engage actively in Dpic and coordination on implementation of ecosystem restoration, science enterprise, and many other topics that we discuss. And to that end, I have two updates for Dpic. The department published the Delta Conservation Framework in December of 2018, and this is the department's effort to work collaboratively with many of the agencies at this table and stakeholders to think about a new way forward for how to plan and implement conservation in the Delta, Yolo, and Sassoon Marsh. And also we published Frank's Tracked Futures. We've come to talk to Dpic about that. And the department's moving forward with a contract to continue that work, continue engineering and stakeholder outreach and integration, thinking about that process moving forward. So thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Josephine Axt. I'm the Chief of Planning with the Corps' Regional Office, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. The Delta has flood risk management, ecosystem restoration, and navigation challenges. Those are the three primary mission areas of the Corps, so it hits the spot on all those things. Having said that, coming from the regional office, our area includes a very large southwestern portion of the United States. So for me, being in the Bay Area, it's great to focus more on the Delta. We have, I think it may have come up, this is my second meeting. I think at the last meeting there was mention made of a Corps of Engineers study that's going to actually look at implementation in the Delta for restoration purposes, which is exciting. Yeah, and I'm glad to be here, and I think the value of these meetings really is the collaboration and coordination at this level that we can all do. So good to be here.
Good afternoon. My name is Campbell Ingram. I'm the Executive Officer of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta Conservancy. We're the state conservancy that serves the Delta and the Sassoon Marsh. Our role is to do ecosystem restoration and economic development, and I won't do much more of an introduction because you're going to hear from me extensively under agenda item number 3. But as always, very appreciative of this group and the opportunity to come together. This is my first meeting in well over a year. Just circumstantially, I missed the last two, so it's good to be back.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So, hi, I'm John Calloway. I'm the Delta Lead Scientist with the Science Program and the Stewardship Council. I'm happy to be here to talk to incorporate science into all of our management decisions. I have two quick updates. One, the Delta Science Plan that we've been working on for the last year to update, and that the Dpic endorsed at the previous meeting is finished and is at the printer now, and includes the preamble that the Dpic incorporated into the science plan. So as soon as that's available, we'll distribute that to you. And then I also wanted to let you know that the solicitation effort that the science program, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation put out in October of last year, that is moving forward, and we're just about finished with decisions. The science program and the Stewardship Council. The Stewardship Council will be considering recommendations for funding at their meeting in April, later this month, and California Department of Fish and Wildlife, I think, is very close to making their decisions as well. We're going to fund over $15 million of science within the Delta through that, and we had over 60 applications for that, so it was really a great effort, multi-agency effort, highlighting One Delta, One Science to bring everyone together and really bring in some high quality proposals that we were able to be very selective from and be able to really push science forward within the Delta.
Greetings. My name is Jessica Fain. I'm with the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, sitting in here today for Larry Goldspan. And as I understand it, BCDC is a bit of a new player to this group, so I'm really happy to be here on his behalf and representing the agency. I come from BCDC's planning side as their planning director, and one of the things that we're really excited about now is a project that we have going on with the Delta Stewardship Council and our Adapting to Rising Tides program, where we're looking at sea level rise in eastern Contra Costa with the Stewardship Council, and it's a really promising Bay Delta connection project that we're excited to be involved in, as well as several others. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Kevin Masuhara, Deputy Secretary at California Department of Food and Agriculture. I'm here in place of Secretary Ross. She sends her regrets that she couldn't be here. Of interest to this group, and you'll hear an update later on in the agenda, but our department is participating, and you mentioned collaboration, Secretary Crowfoot, and it underscores that we do work with a lot of different agencies, and Nutria is the agenda item that we collaborate on and provide the expertise that we can that represents some of our capabilities. We deal with invasive pest issues all the time. A lot of them are high-profile insects, but we also deal a lot with terrestrial and aquatic weeds, which could potentially be harmful to the Delta environment. And so I just want to reiterate that our department understands that value of that collaboration that we do.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mike Chikowski. I am the Bay Delta Science Coordinator for the U.S. Geological Survey here in Sacramento. I'm here for Marc Sogi, our Regional Director, who was unable to attend. USGS conducts monitoring and research nationally to support the mission of the Department of the Interior and our interior partner bureaus. We also work with most of the entities at this table, and we have a substantial Bay Delta portfolio. I'm looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have today.
Good afternoon. I'm Kristen Peer, and I work with Secretary Jared Blumenfeld at Cali, PA on water policy issues. And I spend quite a bit of my time on Delta-related issues. For the most part, work carefully with the State Water Board, Joaquin and Wade and many others around the table on the Water Quality Control Plan update, and also spend quite a bit of time these days working on the voluntary agreement process that is underway. And so look forward to continuing that effort and also hearing all the good things that we have to hear on the agenda today. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Gail Louie, and I'm with EPA, US EPA. I'm here representing Tomas Torres, who passes on his regrets for not being able to be here. I just want to mention that there are a couple of things that we're working on that, with regard to funding, we put out an RFP last fall for our San Francisco Bay Water Quality Improvement Fund. We're in the process of making some decisions, and we'll be awarding approximately $8 million worth of projects, and the announcement should be coming out in the next few weeks. And then in addition, we have a small RFP out for wetland program development grants, and if folks are interested, that closes the end of April. So if people are interested, I can provide more information. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Dan Castleberry. I'm the Assistant Regional Director for Fish and Aquatic Conservation with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. Here for Paul Souza, my Regional Director, who also sends his regrets that he wasn't able to be here. A couple things to highlight. As Dave Mooney with the Bureau of Reclamation mentioned, we're working on the reinitiated consultation on the coordinated operations of the state and federal water projects. We received a biological assessment from Reclamation on January 31st, and in accordance with the presidential memo on Western Water, we will have completed our consultation by June 17th. That's a major area we're focused on, and I know of general interest to many around the table. A couple of the other things I'd just like to highlight. For the first time recently, there's been the use of cultured delta smelt in the wild. They're not entirely in the wild, they're held in net pens out in the delta, but we see this as a major step forward in the development of a tool that can aid us with both science and recovery of delta smelt ultimately. So a major milestone that just happened this winter and spring. And then I also wanted to highlight that we're working with a number of interests around the table, but also in the fishing community, both commercial and recreational fishers, looking at alternative release strategies for fall run Chinook salmon from our Coleman National Fish Hatchery up near Anderson on the Sacramento River. Those are just two examples this spring that I think are going to help us move forward with some of the goals associated with many of the efforts we have here at Dpic. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Carla Namath, the Director of the Department of Water Resources. I think maybe the last time I participated in the implementation committee was when I had been with the California Natural Resources Agency. But I'm excited about my new role as DWR Director and participating today. A couple of things that are top of mind for me as the department approaches how to make important progress in the Delta is really starting to put together the department's multiple roles in the Delta, particularly bringing the flood protection work of the department in line with some of the other work that we're doing on behalf of the State Water Project. As that relates to physical restoration in the Delta, I'm excited by some of the department's recent work to actually bring ecosystem values into the land values in the Delta, into that equation. It's absolutely essential for us in working with the local Delta counties and working with landowners in the Delta and doing it in a way that reflects Delta as a place. So I'm grateful for the Secretary's opening comments and his interest in ensuring that his department stay focused on that as a key approach to everything that we do in the Delta. The department itself also has significant efforts underway in advancing our understanding of science in the Delta, and I'm very grateful to the Stewardship Council and the Interagency Implementation Committee and being a very important convener of all of those efforts, and I look forward to today's discussion. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kyle Weaver. I'm the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Water and Science, which is probably the longest title that anyone has here. This is my first time here. I've been in this job for 3 months now. That said, as Joaquin knows well, I served as the staff director for the Subcommittee on Water and Power in the House for 14 years. To be candid, I'm used to a lot of conflict on California water as I'm in DC. So as I've been briefed and as I've read through all the materials, this seems to be the antithesis of conflict. So I look forward to all the collaboration that goes on, and thanks for allowing me to be here.
Thank you all. Thank you for sharing your activities. I have one quick one to share with you, and that is that our performance measures dashboard is live. This is a major milestone for the council, and if you go to on the web, view performance.deltacouncil.ca.gov, you'll be able to get a high-level overview of the performance measures that measure progress in achieving the co-equal goals. We also have a handbook, which is in your binder. This website allows you to go as deep as you want into the data and the rationale behind the performance measures. So I invite you to take a look at the website and explore when you have time. So with that, let's dive in. I invite Randy Fiorini, Amanda Bowl, and Jason Peltier to come up. So over the past several years, the Council and Dpic have been discussing the science enterprise and in particular funding and governance. In 2016, we held the Science Enterprise Workshop. We've also held science governance panel discussions at Dpic and at council meetings, and during the summer of 2018, we had a summer series on data to decision making. So to further explore science funding, the former council chair and Dpic chair, Randy Fiorini, convened a work group devoted to discussing how to increase funding for decision support science in the Delta. And that work group drafted the white paper that's in your binder, titled Funding Science to Meet Tomorrow's Challenges. While reviewing that white paper and the updated science plan, the Delta Independent Science Board identified a need to step back and consider whether or not the science enterprise is conducting the science it needs to conduct, and if the science is up to the task of managing science in a rapidly changing climate. The Delta ISB put those thoughts in a letter to Dpic, that also is in your binder. So today we will hear from Amanda and Randy and Jason about the white paper, and from Dr. Jalen, Dr. Norgard, and Dr. Brandt on the ISB recommendations. Amanda? Oh, I do want to note one person who will be here later. Maria Ray for NOAA Fisheries was called to an urgent matter. I'm imagining it might have something to do with the biological opinion, so she'll be joining us at 1:30. And I do want to note that the Dpic member who has traveled the furthest, I would guess, is Kyle Weaver, coming all the way from Washington, D.C. at 3 a.m. this morning. So thank you.
So if I say something bad, you're excused.
There. Okay, there we go. Okay, well, thank you, Chair Tatayan, and good afternoon, Dpic members. Chair Tatayan provided a bit of background, and I'll just provide a bit more context for this particular topic. Following a panel presentation at the State of the Estuary Conference, Randy Fiorini launched the Delta Science Funding Initiative Work Group to identify how to adequately fund decision support science in the Delta. Thanks to the Science Enterprise Workshop, which happened in 2016, we knew that expenditures in the Delta were notably less than other similar large-scale ecological efforts, and that the funding we do have is largely limited to core monitoring, status and trends monitoring, and some targeted research. The work group explored all of this in greater detail, developing action-oriented recommendations and drafting a collaborative document representing support from a diverse membership. Randy's going to talk a bit about the process that the work group undertook to get to the recommendations that are outlined in the white paper that is in your binders. And Jason will present the primary findings and recommendations from the white paper. So with that, I will ask Randy.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. And Madam Chairperson Susan Tatayan, it's great to see you in that seat. And it's great to see all of you from this perspective. I enjoy a turning of the tables. Amanda talked about the Science Enterprise Workshop, which was ordained by this group, that led to a panel at the State of the Delta Estuary Conference, Bay Estuary Conference in October of 2017, where Carl Wilcox, Dr. John Callaway, Leo Winternitz, Jason Peltier, Josh Collins with the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and myself were on a panel to talk about Delta science funding. I knew we were onto something when Leo Winternitz suggested that all we need to do is to tax the water users, and Jason responded by saying, well, we need to consider all the options. So great. As the chair of the Delta Stewardship Council, my job was always to look for opportunities. So immediately after that panel, I asked Jason and Leo if they'd be interested in having a further discussion about this idea of improving Delta science funding. And of course, with this group, that has been the common thread through every one of our meetings, is the linkage and that brings us together around science. We met in the office and we decided to form a Delta Science Funding Initiative Group. It began in the spring of 2018, and you have a list of, okay, you will soon see a list of about 30 people who eventually can comprise that work group. It started out with about a half a dozen of us, and we added members as we needed more expertise or agency or stakeholder representation. Just a side note, it's been a wonderful group to work with. I had the privilege of chairing this. We met every 6 to 8 weeks. We've processed about 6 different drafts of the white paper that you have before us. I just, and I'll talk about this when you get to the decision making about whether to form a work group or not. I have some thoughts about that. So initially, we were concerned that much of the funding for Delta Science goes to what we were then calling compliance science, regulatory requirements. We believed that about 80% of the money spent on Delta Science was required, and that the decisions support science, science that often requires 10 or more years of study, was not receiving adequate funding. So you can see in the goal on the white paper that the goal has held through the whole process, that we were looking for an ongoing, consistent, relevant, and reliably funded science enterprise providing usable information directly linked to critical management questions of a diverse set of stakeholders, federal and state agency managers, and scientists. So that was our initial goal. The work grew beyond that into discussing governance. It grew into talking about how to operate more efficiently with the funding that we have. And one of the surprises that we discovered early on, we thought, well, we can't really talk about the need for more funding until we assess what we're currently spending. Finding out what we're spending, the sources and the uses, was a lot more difficult than any of us thought there would be. There was no go-to source for this. So we had to compile a worksheet depending on every one of your agencies to contribute. What are you spending? Where does it go? Our initial estimate of about $40 million being spent actually was understated by a lot. It's closer to $80 to $100 million that's being spent. So the white paper has some very significant findings as well as some recommendations, and I will defer to Jason now to describe those for you, but I'd like Susan to have an opportunity to describe when you get to the discussion phase about what a work group should look like. Thanks.
Thanks, Randy. A couple of comments up front. First, I'm identified in your agenda as being with the Coalition for a Sustainable Delta. I've left that position to work for the next 2.5 months with my wife and work through some health issues. So I'm just a citizen now, and it feels pretty good. A second point, Randy, I've got to clarify when I said everything's on the table. That comment comes from my days in the Foreign Service and my diplomatic experiences, so trust me, I won't lose sight of that. Third, I'm not going to really focus too much on the findings because they're pretty simple, they're pretty clear. They have to do with kind of modernizing the system of all kinds. That term governance is a pretty broad term that includes a lot more than just who's making what decisions. It's how we're working together, and I think that is the important focus of our work going forward. I'd like to first start though by thanking Randy and it was his leadership and support of the Amanda and the other Stewardship Council staff that made this work. We had fantastic participation. As you can imagine, when you're talking about other people's money or your money, everybody's going to be at the table, right? So that was the team made it work so much. And as I think as Randy described, many opportunities emerged and evolved out of our conversations, and this is where I think going forward with implementation planning, a plan for implementation and action for implementation is going to be really show where there's some value in this whole exercise. There's been great value to date, but ultimately the value is going to be in what are we going to do about what we've learned, and we've learned an awful lot. Yeah, that $100 million was a surprise. For years I've been saying 20. I just kind of made it up and nobody corrected me. But that was a surprise for a lot of us, and it changed the conversation from we need more money from science to maybe we need to look at how we're spending what we've got, and can we get more out of what we're getting, because I think a common feeling is that compliance monitoring is important, there's no question, but a lot of it is legacy, a lot of it is just counting, so to speak, and we're not learning a lot from that investment. So there's some areas for improvement there that are, I think, important. As these different doors open, we saw, as I say, opportunities for carrying things forward, and this brings me to some 7 quick conclusions that I've arrived at relative to this effort, but this effort is an umbrella effort that captures so much of what we're talking about and doing in the Delta and around the Delta. First is that we have a very tangled web that we've created, all of us and our predecessors, in how we manage the Delta, how we manage science, how we manage the water projects, how we manage ourselves. Felicia's ecosystem notion comes to mind. And we can, as we look at through this tangled web, through the lens of the money and the financial resources that we're dedicating, address that web. At least we can have a conversation about it. I think it's a professionally responsible thing to do, is to have that conversation about, we're here now. There's a relatively new crowd here now. We're all here voluntarily trying to work together. How can we understand the web we've created and make it work to further our ends more efficiently and effectively? I think that's a conversation that is really important and really fits with the conversation these guys are going to have about the Independent Science Board. 2 quick examples of how we can modernize our system. Randy mentioned the financial things. We've got that spreadsheet was apples and pears, apples and oranges, and we need to make it all pears. We need to make it so we have a uniform process for tracking and understanding our money. And then there's monitoring. The Independent Science Board has a special effort going on relative to monitoring. But there's about 200 plus monitoring programs that are undertaken in the Delta. And like many things we do, I bet for a lot of those, we just do it because it's a legacy and we've always done it. And we don't know the value of what we're doing. So we need to look at and modernize that. We need to recognize that this whole discussion about finances and financial resources in Delta fits in a lot of other venues. I mean, it's first of all, it's paramount to making the existing system work, which is what everybody is ultimately dedicated to. It fits with voluntary settlement agreements. It fits with the collaborative science efforts in CSAMP and CAMP. So it goes to many places. For this conversation to go forward, it needs to be nurtured and prioritized by your agencies, and you, the leaders of those agencies. That's really, really important, because as we go further into understanding and trying to modernize our system, we will be stepping on toes. There's no question about it, and that's important. So the implementation plan that I hope you will set in motion and set some expectations for is going to be critical. And the last point I'd like to make is that Secretary Weaver had his finger right on it. You know, we're notorious for our conflict in California water, but in this science space, there's a lot of scientific disagreement, but there is very little conflict over the basic notion that in order to make better decisions and improve the system for all, to leave the status quo behind us, that we need to have better understanding of how the system operates, and we find that through collaborative science. And I think that is a happy place to work, and it's a satisfying place to work. It's a place where we can have realistic expectations of making progress. So, thank you.
So did you have a PowerPoint presentation?
Well, we did, and it's in front of all of you, but unfortunately we went through most of what we were going to be talking about that went with the slides. So I think for now we can just keep moving on to probably the ISB's presentation.
I guess technical difficulties.
Yeah, apologies.
Does that mean that the ISB's presentation will...
No, it's going. As soon as they get going, I will get it put up, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'll start off on behalf of the Delta Independent Science Board, and I want to thank Dpic for the invitation to come here and discuss our recommendations concerning development of forward-looking strategic science, sort of in the context of environmental change. And for today, Dick Norgard will give us a brief overview of some of the theoretical underpinnings that really helped to inspire our letter, and that'll be followed by Jay Lund, who will give us some more specifics on our letter and on our specific recommendations. So, Dick, you want to lead us off?
So, that opening sentence, opening question, probably has 80% of the content that I have to discuss. That basically, we're in the Anthropocene, we're seeing things changing much more rapidly, and our science is the science we have had under conditions where we thought nature changed little or very slowly. So we're in the Anthropocene. We really don't have a choice of going slower. We got to go fast. And the question is, how far ahead can we look? And to what extent is the current Delta science helping us do that? And if not, how do we find a new science? Basically, environmental scientists have been studying the nature that is out there. Change is observed over time, but it is thought it's kind of a disturbance, or it's a deviation against what naturally occurs. And we do have models that have changed. We have pressure state models where a force can be on a system, and we can go out and observe that change. But we do not have models with lots of things changing. Temperature, precipitation, sea level, invasive species, all this stuff going on simultaneously. And so the science we have is good for driving 10 miles an hour, but we're going 80 now. We don't have any choice. This is the way it's going to be for the next 200 years. And that's important to keep in mind. So let's go back in history. If you go between 1870 and 1920, the delta was in a very rapid change period. There wasn't much science done. We've since done sort of retroactive, what was the delta like? And that understanding helps us a little bit on the fringes of the delta, where we can kind of restore some of the historic processes. But it doesn't help us in the main questions of how to manage flows and save salmon and other things. It's peripheral knowledge. Most of the knowledge we have has been accumulated since the 1950s, and a good portion of that, I don't know what portion, but a large portion of that is already obsolete, just because the delta has continued to change. The pressures on the delta have continued to change. But still, we've kind of been doing the same science. We've been doing it faster. We've been doing more of it. But we haven't really broken into a new mode. So the question is, how should we do science and get it done and get answers in time for policymakers and managers to actually be able to use this information before it's obsolete, before the delta has again moved on to a new state? And that sounds like a devilishly difficult question, but that's kind of where we are. The Delta ISB was kind of confused and disturbed and upset by these questions, partly because we didn't have the answers. And we're supposed to be the independent science board that makes all science decisions. And we had to punt on this. We are basically saying we need to go out and have conversations with other scientists who do look at longer time periods, who do try to look ahead, and that's going to be in the proposal that Jay will be making. Some scientists have been giving this more serious thought. We also know that in other regions, particularly the Great Lakes, there's been more planning for climate change. We found one scientific article about ecology in the Anthropocene, and the central premise of this article was, well, when climate science becomes more predictable, then we'll be able to predict the ecological changes. Unfortunately, climate science has it's just been opening a bigger and bigger Pandora's box. It hasn't become more predictable, it's become less. And I want to talk about that a little bit with the diagram that was made basically about 20 years ago. And there's all kinds of scenarios of emissions during the next 100 years. The highest scenario is really high, way up there. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says, well, it looks like most of these scenarios are kind of in this middle range. Let's just emphasize those and not worry about those outliers. By the time they were doing the report in 2013, because this is updated every 5 to 8 years, we were already off the charts of the 2002 report. We were at that little star above the blue line. And that's in almost no time at all. And that's because we really misjudged how quickly we would cut back on our emissions. We misjudged how fast the polar ice would melt, affecting sea level rise and the Earth's albedo. We misjudged how much heat the oceans would absorb, which resulted in more rapid sea level rise, but also resulted in less terrestrial warming. But we don't know how much longer that might occur. And once it stops, then the terrestrial warming will become fierce. We also greatly underestimated, this is just in decadal periods, the amount of ecological or biospherical feedbacks, in particular the forest fire feedbacks, but also the melting of the tundra and the releasing of methane and carbon dioxide in the Arctic. These are things which became known in a 20-year period, and yet we're still learning things. So we tried in the 2013 to make uncertainty the central narrative, But that proved very difficult. There was just this strong tendency, we want to predict, we're scientists, we predict. But we were able to keep a fair amount of the narrative around the uncertainty. This diagram is a little difficult to see. On the x-axis is peak temperatures in centigrade above pre-industrial levels, and on the y-axis is probabilities, and you can see that the highest probabilities are between 2 and 4 degrees centigrade. This again is a graph that's 15 years old, but it was a graph that led people to say, well, yeah, between 2 and 4 degrees centigrade, that's probably where things are going to happen. But notice that this thing has what's called a fat tail. And if you look at that 6 degree centigrade line, there's an indication that 10% of the area under this curve is for warming 6 degrees and greater. Now, warming of 6 degrees, 7 degrees, 8 degrees, 10 degrees, that's serious warming, and 10% chance is not like a low probability. That's like a very high probability. So again, we need to shift towards being prepared for the unknown and being able to respond quickly and to use our science to discover these things and get that information back as quickly as possible. This is not the time to be optimizing ecology versus water supply. This is a time to be forward-thinking and risk-reducing as much as possible. One possibility is we could concentrate on looking at future thresholds and what are the conditions that would result in those thresholds being crossed. And if they are crossed, then what kind of a world are we in and what is left to manage then? It's a pretty dismal way of looking at it because we usually are always saying, yes, we're going to restore and everything's going to get better. But we're in times where things are changing and our criteria for the good are going to be tested. But we need to be ready for change. And we need the science that does that. I don't know what that science is, but I think we need to find out and start thinking about it.
Thank you, Dick. Just to expand just a little bit on that and to get to what we're looking for here. I think everybody's been pretty impressed lately, almost everybody's been impressed lately about climate change in the Delta, and it is, after all, a delta at the sea, and the sea level is going to go up. There's really no doubt that sea level is going to go up. It's been going up for the last 10,000 years. It's going to go up a lot more in the coming years. Temperature is also rising. But we have other changes, not just climate change, that keep us looking further forward than, as Dick put it nicely, 20 miles an hour ahead when things are really moving a lot faster. One is we have a lot of new invasive species. You'll have some more discussion later on today about nutria. We have a lot of other, from the microscopic to the macroscopic scale of plants and animals coming into this system. That's also going to be affected by climate change, but it's an additional change aside from climate change. The composition of the ecosystems that we're managing is changing. We're also looking at really what could be revolutionary changes in the way we regulate environmental flows and water management in the Delta, with voluntary agreements and big changes in the water quality control plan for the Delta and the tributaries. And then in addition, we have some pretty big changes that are occurring in groundwater management south of the Delta, particularly, and water demands and the structure of particularly agricultural and urban water demands on the Delta. So we're looking at a lot of different changes, and we have to manage them all together. And we have to have the science prepare us to get out ahead of these changes, because science doesn't work overnight. It takes us a little while to agree on things. It takes a little while to discuss it, what that means for management, and then you guys get to decide. It's important to prepare for these changes, these opportunities and the changes that we're going to have to manage. it looks a little bit from the science perspective, when we looked at the Delta Science Plan update, it looked a little bit like we were studying firefighting when really we should also be studying building codes. We want to build this thing out into the future so it's less resistant to the fires, more resistant to the fires that we see coming. So what do we want to see, I think, is some sort of Dpic buy-in to a task force that takes a longer-term view of the management of science and the scientific missions for the Delta. Two main areas I think that this task force needs to address, in addition to the funding and the other aspects that the other committee has brought forward. One is, how do we develop our long-term science to prepare for the long-term changes that we see coming? Not just to get through this current administration, but 2 or 3 administrations further forward. Not to saying that this administration is going to be a short one. Either administration. And then the other side of it is to look at the long-term management of science. We now have a lot of different science going on in a lot of different places, and sometimes we talk to each other, and sometimes we have longer-term missions. We really need to get outside of ourselves and really look at the problem in a longer-term vein, 50 to 100 years, rather than just what's the next, trend, fashion that we have in the science and the management and the policy. So I guess that's what we're asking for, and I'll turn that over to whoever's talking next.
Thank you, all of you. So, DPIC members, we had some questions in your agenda, and if any of you would like to begin the discussion with the first question, what are critical steps to address or implement recommendations in either the science white paper or the ISB recommendations? Any thoughts on that? Oh, welcome, Maria. Thanks for joining us.
Well, one question I'd ask, so first of all, impressive presentation, and I think you drive the point home effectively that, the changes that we're experiencing demand deeper collaboration and more adaptation in terms of the science that we're doing. But I guess the question for the group here is, do agencies and leaders around the table align on that? This is part of the first question is, if we're going to try to make progress on helping our science be more intertwined and be able to inform adaptive management more closely, we should agree or disagree or talk through the premise. So I'm interested to know where others, if others, feel like this observation resonates from the independent scientists, that we need to change the way we do science in the Delta, and also what are the practical limitations of doing that?
Okay. I can't answer your question directly, but I would like to ask the panel for a little bit of clarification. Full disclosure, I was part of the group that Randy Fiorini organized, so I participated in most of the discussions about governance and science funding that have happened up to this point. And one of the things that struck me reading both of these documents is that there was a recommendation that no one has articulated yet from the table over there, that one of the next steps be to do a more penetrating analysis of what we're actually doing and sort out what science needs exist now that aren't being well served by the many programs that are doing science currently. And for my part, I would appreciate some comment from the members of the panel on that question.
I'll take the first stab at it. I think what you're going to find in the white paper and with the complementary addition of the Independent Science Board's suggestions is that it's going to fall into 3 categories. Number 1, sources and uses need to be better accounted for. And the state water contractors in cooperation with the Department of Water Resources, I believe maybe the Bureau is also involved, are working on a template for accounting for science funding that every agency will be able to use and report annually. That will help us get at the sources and uses. The second area that needs to be looked into is governance, and that came up a lot. You know, who's involved and how is it managed? The Independent Science Board touched on that too. There's a need to review and perhaps make some recommendations within the regulatory flexibility that each of the agencies represented at Dpic have. And then the third issue, let's see, we've got funding, we've got and I touched on governance. What's the third one? Yeah, well, it's a term, I'll say efficiencies, all right? So we've got the funding, we've got governance, and then what about efficiencies? What, Jason touched on this. We've got 200 other so-on activities in the Delta. Is there overlap? Is there things that are no longer necessary? If we're spending $100 million, what are we getting for that? So I think what I hope will come out of this is a Dpic endorsed work group that will look at sources and uses, we'll look at governance, and we'll look at where efficiencies might be gained. Does that help, Mike?
If I could add, sorry, that kind of knocked me off track. Mike, I think you saw at that table, there's a lot of creative juices there, and I would not expect the charge from Dpic to say, this is what you need to do. This is where we want to go in broad terms. You people that are in the trenches or in mid-level management or high-level management, as this is the case with some, you brainstorm, you figure it out, you tell us what the next steps are, and you work on it. I would add that in addition to the kind of convergence with the Independent Science Board observations, there's a real important convergence of this work effort with what's going on in our federal and state workforce and in the stakeholder community too. There is we were really lucky that we had some of the most experienced people in the Delta sitting around the table. Carl Wilcox, Ted Summer, working through these things and talking through them and trying to understand. But when you look at the collective years of experience, knowledge that are going to be walking out the door over the next 5-10 years, it's pretty staggering. So this kind of stepping back and trying to say how can we ask ourselves, how can we refocus? What are our priorities? Are they the same as they've always been? Should they evolve? That's a great gift to the next generation of managers and scientists that's coming along that I think we owe them, because that change is inevitable. You're all dealing with it in your agencies. You see it, you understand it, and the implications of it. And this work effort could have make a great contribution to that reality.
If I can follow that up a little bit, Mike, one of the things that came out in both the science funding strategy as well as the latest revision to the Delta Science Plan was the need for sort of topic-specific science implementation plans. And I think that one of the things that the board was talking about in that light is sort of the strategic long-term science needs in the context of a changing environment. And we specifically suggested to do a needs assessment, scientific needs assessment. And Dick talked a little bit about the long-term climate change, 50 to 100 years. There's also short-term climate change in the context of seasons and years, and extreme events. We all know that extremes are no longer extreme, they're more the norm. And that context and the ability to, let's say, forecast seasonal or interannual climate with regards to drought or floods, and that provides a whole new opportunity for ecosystem management, for adaptive management, things like that. And I think that the science surrounding that needs to be looked at. What do we really need to know? What can we predict? What are the appropriate time and space scales that make it relevant to stakeholders and management alike? And I think that level of forward-looking kind of strategic thinking about the science, in addition to what's going on now and what we're talking about in the funding strategy, is just one additional thing, or probably one primary thing that at least the Science Board is proposing in this context.
Thank you for the presentation. I think a comment and a question for you all. One, I wholeheartedly agree that we certainly need to get more efficient with our dollars, and the first step in that is sorting out where we're spending money and where is there overlap. And the department has a commitment to that, and I'll reiterate that here. It's extremely important to the department and the operations of the State Water Project when we know we're going to have a lot of resource needs related to aging infrastructure for DWR to do a better job about how we account for our science funding and how that does or does not fit or complement some of the investments that other entities are making. So yes, we need to do more of that, and DWR will certainly be a partner from the top down and the bottom up with your agencies in getting to that. What I think I hear you saying is in that context, you all have also identified some near-term issues where we're doing quite a bit of investment, maybe in some of the monitoring and sort of more specific data gathering, but investing less science or less money in science that is maybe more decadal or little, I can't remember the not a term of art, your term of science that you used for that, but we also need to focus more investment on some of those near term or longer term kinds of issues that enable us to make better resource management decisions. So in that context then, how would you and how could the Independent Science Board, or do you have suggestions around how we would marry that additional investment or change in approach, if you will, or reprioritization with this idea that at the same time we need to be moving away from maybe language of optimization and more towards language of risk management? So what could the science panel and those communities do to help us as, well, certainly me as a government agency, bring to the table this idea that maybe we need to reframe some questions because that's the reality that's coming to us, and it's coming to us sooner than we thought even 2 years ago. Do you have any thoughts on that and how that could work?
Well, I can start out a little bit, and this is just one example. And in the Science Enterprise Workshop, one of the things that came out of there was a greater emphasis on ecosystem forecasting and doing science that focuses on making forecasts or formal predictions, forecasts rather than explanatory science. You know, if I explain to you why it rained yesterday, it's not as important to telling you what might happen down the line in the future. And the science it's not necessarily replacing science, it's more of a different emphasis on what you're focusing on. In terms of thinking that way forces you to focus more on the drivers, what's really driving it, and particularly what are going to be the drivers in the future that are going to be that I need to make decisions on. That's just kind of one example. It's sort of just a different way of approaching the science you're doing, and I think it's a way that can be. There's a lot of ways of approaching that particular science.
I think it would be premature for us to have specific suggestions on what to do. To me, the most important thing is that we get a conversation, a broader conversation, that's not just academics, not just scientists, talking about how should we move forward on this together, how should we organize, fund, deliver, make use of science broadly for these long-term problems that we know we're going to have, and the long-term opportunities that will come with them from time to time. So I think at this point, having some sort of a task force, or maybe series of task forces as you like, that convene some meetings and some discussions that go on, not forever, but for a period of a few months. If this committee is interested in sponsoring that, commissioning that kind of a conversation, I think it would go a long way in making sure that that conversation is more effective and more useful.
If I could add, your opening comments about getting a clear picture on our finances is really, really important. I think it's probably the central achievable thing we can do in the short run. We're going to identify a lot of things that we're not going to be able to accomplish, but it's just accounting, right? But I think it's important coming from DWR, and it's important coming from the Bureau, because when you look at that $100 million a year being spent on science, and recognize that does not include personnel costs, so it's a super conservative number. The bulk of it's coming from DWR and the Bureau, and the bulk of that is coming from the water user community, from the contractor community. So the question is one of the biggest questions for us, one of the biggest drivers for us is not, is there reliable funding in terms of money coming from the water community, because we pay our bills, it's very reliable. The bigger question is there a way to diversify and broaden the sources of that money beyond the water user community and get more general fund money or general appropriations, or in a non-reimbursable way? Because clearly the monitoring has a lot to do with the operation of the projects, antiquated as the monitoring may be. But a lot of the learning that we need to do in the Delta is a broad, great public interest in terms of the ecological health of the Delta, and for that we should have broader sources of funding.
So, if I could just take a minute to check in here. What I'm hearing is a tension between funding, efficiencies, and science that needs to be happening more rapidly. And I don't think that we're going to resolve today the question that Secretary Crowfoot asked, are we in alignment about this need to accelerate and be able to see into the future. And this reminds me of in the 1980s, there was this term futurist, and a lot of corporations who wanted to stay ahead of the game, Chrysler, Ford, the big car companies and other manufacturing companies, the airplane producers, all had futurists. Futurists are no longer hired. So I think one of the first steps we need to take really is for a work group to sort out where are we really, what do we really mean by accelerated science? How much faster do we have to go? How much more? I know you can't put a dollar amount on it, but if we're spending $80 to $1 million a year, did you say, already? I think it would be good to get a better handle on the value we're getting, the science that we're getting, whether or not that science is in fact explanatory or risk management. Maybe some of it already is risk management science. So I'd like for that work group to come back with a tentative answer to the question of, are we in alignment, and if we are not in alignment, as to the kinds of science and how far into the future we need to look, what do we need to do to get into alignment, and what kind of science do we, or should we be starting to get ahead of the curve. And there's one question that I have in mind in reading both of these documents. It seems that depending on who is speaking, the words management decision have a different meaning. So if you're speaking to a state water project operator, his set of management decisions are very different than if you're speaking to the director of water resources. So I'd like to get a better handle on what are the management decisions that the sets of science activity are addressing. And that, I think, would help us understand what topic-specific science needs to be conducted and what these suggested science centers would look like.
Susan, I can't answer that question exactly, but I can provide an example. This body endorsed the Science Action Agenda last year, and that was an effort that was surveying all the Dpic agencies to determine where are the gaps in science that need to be addressed that aren't currently being addressed. So we have a menu to work from. The relationship of that list of activities to funding is useful for this conversation, because for the first time since 2010, the Delta Stewardship Council had $2 million to apply to implementing science and furthering the Science Action Agenda. That, in cooperation with funds from the Fish and Wildlife and from the Bureau, amounted to $10 million that was just appropriated. That's an example of decision support science addressing gaps that you all, your agencies, have all identified as a need. We shouldn't have to wait 9 years between funding sources to be able to do that. That should be an annual funding stream to support what the agencies at this table have already agreed are information gaps that science can fill.
Clyde.
Clyde McDonald with the Flood Board. You know, you take Dr. Norgard and you kind of run kind of what he was saying about the future, and kind of as it comes back in the kind of little world that I live in with the department and with the Corps of Engineers is under the law, the Department of Water Resources prepares a flood plan and presents that to the Flood Board, which acts kind of like the hearing officer, and we can amend and so forth. We've done a plan. We've done the first update. The second update is going to come in 2022, and I'm sure you know exactly how we deal with the Delta. We've got big problems on the San Joaquin River, which then flows into the Delta. I think there's going to need to be an integration of the engineering and the costs and kind of the science, especially the farther out you go. I mean, when you go farther out, you have bigger risks to earthquakes, floods, and other kinds of things. And how do we respond to those things is going to be really important. And it's not going to be just something. I mean, I worked my career in the legislature. It's not going to be simply policy. A lot of it is going to be driven by cost, risk, and other kinds of implications, which are going to be really, really difficult. So I think we need to have an integration of kind of the things there and the things the department is doing and what the board does.
I want to thank the panelists again and my colleagues for the great discussion. I think this is, you know, it really is one of the foundational issues that we have to get a grasp on if we're going to be successful in actually better managing the Delta and overcoming the sort of Byzantine Rube Goldberg sort of system that we've set up for ourselves in tackling these challenges. You know, as the chair of the agency that is responsible for a good bit of that regulatory reporting that goes on, it would be helpful to hear the importance, or to maybe acknowledge, I would say, the importance of keeping some of that long-term monitoring trends and data in there. That although I will say that I am completely committed to making sure that the State Water Resources Control Board does its own, thorough internal assessment so as to be able to connect to then the rest of you and your work, and try to get a better handle on this. And so, we have a lot of work to do internally in that discussion, I think, to us as an agency around where is the data going currently that we require insofar as our permits on the projects, where is it housed, how is it being provided back out to the public writ large, because that's where academics can then do the research on. It can then continue to inform our discussions in a way that's actually useful and not simply being reported for reporting's sake and kind of put up on a shelf somewhere. But I guess my question then would be just how you see that moving forward. How do you identify long-term, at this point, monitoring data that needs to be protected, that is actually important to then being able to make these longer term into the future sort of discussions and extrapolations? And yeah, just generally, how best do we make sure to protect that as we say, yes, let's have a rediscussion, let's refresh maybe our approach and some of those reporting requirements, but how do we make sure we, I guess, keep and protect those that are actually really important for that long-term trend data?
That is a conversation that occurs every time, absolutely every time somebody says, why are we doing all this monitoring and just putting the data in a shoebox and nobody's really learning anything from it and it's just sitting there. Then comes the pushback of, we have a very unique mountain of data in the Delta in that we have these long-term data sets. But I think we can learn something from, and it's not, I would argue, I'm not a monitoring expert, but just based on what I've heard in all those conversations, you don't have to sacrifice understanding the Delta, lose ground in understanding the Delta by modernizing what you're doing. If you look at the Delta smelt monitoring, for instance, and what the Fish and Wildlife Service has done with the enhanced Delta smelt monitoring over the last few years, it was in recognition that, maybe the midwater trawl isn't so good for picking up Delta smelt because they maybe don't hang out in the midwater of the channels where the big boats can go. And maybe we need to look at different places, different ways, different times, and to learn more about the smelt. And so that's a great example of somebody stepping back and saying, there is a better way to do this. We can learn more. Now, some will argue, everybody will recognize the value of the fall midwater trawl in that there is a big data set there. And I think we can figure out how to be more effective in our monitoring and preserve a semblance of what the value of that long-term data set is. I mean, it does tell us things about the health of the Delta and how the species and organisms are behaving. But it's one of those things. Just because we always have done it, doesn't mean we got to do it always in the future. And especially when we recognize that we haven't learned that much, or it hasn't informed us enough to make the right policy and operational choices and regulatory choices to improve the health of the species we're worried about and we're monitoring. So there will be trade-offs, but we need not fear modernization here and loss of some increment of the data set that is out there, because I frankly don't know that we recognize or exploit the value of the data set as it is.
So I need to leave in a moment, but I did want to endorse the notion of a working group to flesh out these issues and answer these questions. From my view, at the very least, this working group can help us understand how we avoid duplication and capture synergies in the various scientific activities of our agencies. At best, our agencies and our departments can move toward finding a common forward-looking scientific research agenda. That won't be the end-all be-all. There obviously needs to be separate scientific activities within the agencies, but I think that there's just a tremendous amount of potential. And if we're looking at, the amount of money that's being spent, $100 million a year, certainly we can find ways to ensure that that amount of money actually achieves scientific outcomes that we'd like to see.
Thanks, Wade. Thanks for coming to the meeting. I think that gets us going on the discussion of a work group. Randy, you had some suggestions on the makeup of that work group?
I do. Can we put up the slide that lists the members? It's on page 3 of the PowerPoint presentation that's in your binder. There are approximately 30 people that ultimately served on this committee. What I'm going to give you is an unusual recommendation. Typically, a group such as ours hands off a report and then somebody else picks it up and carries it on. I'm going to recommend that if you endorse this work group at the Dpic level, that you invite all of the approximately 30 members that have been working on this. Add to that the Dpic agencies that aren't currently represented, and 2 members from the Independent Science Board. Now that'll probably give you about a 40-person committee. Not a problem. Not a problem. And if anybody suggests that that's too many, have them talk to me. Because I think there is momentum that has been built with the group that's there now, and you'll spend a lot less time replowing some of the same furrows, and I think it'll actually lead to greater efficiency by having that keeping that group intact if they wish to serve. So that's my recommendation. Endorse a work group, invite the current members, add to that the Dpic agency members and 2 members of the Independent Science Board.
So Dpic members, is there any discussion about Randy's suggestion on the structure of the work group? Add the flood board. And Josephine.
I like the idea of increased collaboration and integration, but at a certain point it does become too cumbersome. Can you give the 60-second, this is why it would work even with a group that big?
Well, it'll require some leadership,
Yeah.
but I think you'll divide that group of approximately 40 into 2 or 3 subgroups. They preferably will meet monthly with a goal of consolidating their work in September for a report back to you all in November.
John, did you have something?
I have a question. So I like that idea, but one thing, you've talked a lot about funding issues and about the science needs issues. You haven't talked about governance issues. So any thoughts from the panel on, is governance also important to address, and are there some first steps or things that might be where there's opportunities around governance?
Chairwoman Tatayan, I would recommend that you put Dr. John Calloway in charge of the governance subgroup.
I'd much rather do science needs.
Well, I think, as I briefly mentioned earlier, that it's important to have a more global view of the term governance. It's not what authority does this agency have versus that agency and who's making what decisions. It's more a question of how are we working together and how can we work better together, and what are we doing today because we've always done it that we don't need to do anymore, and we can agree on. It's a place to find some efficiencies in communication. You know, we have this tangled web, as I say, because it is a tangled place. It's very complicated, and we have a history of a new problem arises, we respond with a new program or a new monitoring program, and you know, it's this all these things have stacked up, just kind of like your water quality standards. You know, why do we have this standard there at that point and that time, and what's it protective of? And, well, we can't really remember, but it was important at the time, you know, so governance takes us up into a lot of those conversations.
Well, if there's no further discussion among the Dpic members, I propose that Dpic endorse the formation of a work group and have that work group explore how we might implement some of the recommendations in the white paper and the Independent Science Board letter. We're not a voting body, but I see some thumbs up, so I'm hearing no dissent. I think
your vote is by your agency prioritizing this work and dedicating the personnel and resources to make this work, and to be kind of open and honest with everybody about what it is, where we're going, what your concerns and issues are, and how we can address them. That's your vote.
everybody got that hint. Yeah. Okay, then Amanda will follow up with each of the Dpic agencies and get this work group going. Thank you. Thank you all. So before we take a break, I want to just say a few words about our California National Heritage Area. The only National Heritage Area that California has is in the Delta. And this is an effort that the Delta Protection Commission has pursued, a designation of a National Heritage Area for quite some time. They completed a feasibility report. They worked with Senator Feinstein and Representative Garamendi. The council helped as we could, as did the Delta Conservancy, and I want to congratulate the Delta Protection Commission and the Delta Conservancy and all who contributed to making this National Heritage Area happen. So what we're going to do to celebrate is have cake. And Oscar Villegas, the chair of the Delta Protection Commission, will make the first cut of our National Heritage Area cake, and then I think we'll have some folks helping cut the cake and have it for break. So with that, let's have Oscar cut the cake. Isn't that a song? Cut the cake. So next up, we're going to hear about the tremendous progress being made in ecosystem restoration projects in the Delta. And we'll also be hearing from Adrian Covera from the Bay Area Council, Caitlin Sweeney from the San Francisco Estuary Partnership, of course, Mike Roberts from California Natural Resources Agency, and Campbell Ingram from the Delta Conservancy, and Jessica Law will be moderating the panel. So take it away.
Good afternoon, committee members. Thank you. We're really happy to be here. I'm going to give a quick update on some other activities at the council related to the ecosystem amendment. And of course, we'll be hearing a lot about activities both in the Bay Area and throughout the Delta and successes on restoration. Since 2014, the Dpic committee meetings have been a shared venue for discussing progress on restoration actions and providing support for major efforts. Notably, the California Eco-Restore projects have been discussed at every meeting since 2015, including 6 months after the initiative was launched. Council meetings, or excuse me, committee meetings, coordination among members and advisors has resulted in better integration of regional and statewide efforts and has really helped identify barriers and focus action on removing barriers to implementation. Thanks. We're just switching slides here. So the Delta Stewardship Council is currently in the midst of updating Chapter 4 of the Delta Plan. We've been working closely with state, federal, and local agencies to really put a finer point on what long-term actions are needed to support and achieve the vision of a restored landscape. I'd like to briefly discuss our proposed policy approach here and then specifically discuss how Dpic has been working to resolve many of those implementation barriers and strengthen institutional coordination. The Delta Reform Act, which is our guiding legislation, provides goals and strategies to address the physical characteristics of restoration. When the Delta Plan was adopted in 2013, it assumed that the Bay Delta Conservation Plan would be incorporated. And with it, the governance structure and the guidance from that plan would help create structure for the Delta Plan. Now that that process has ended, the Council has been working to develop guidance for state and local and federal agencies to achieve the Delta Reform Act vision and to help achieve the targets in recovery and conservation plans that have been adopted. Over the past year and more, we've really been doing an extensive amount of research as well as taking an input and feedback from the broader community and have developed a proposed regulatory and policy recommendation for the amendment to Chapter 4, one that provides high-level restoration guidance to improve project design, restore ecosystem function at the landscape level, and protect land for opportunities for conservation and safeguard against land loss due to sea level rise and subsidence. The second part of that approach is emphasizing improvements in management actions, interagency coordination, and implementation in a way that really reflects community values and the Delta as a place. These 5 core strategies are proposed, and they really define the regulatory, policy, and collaborative approach that the Council is going to take for implementation. This committee, in its role as a coordinating body, plays a critical role in the governance structure and can support implementation through leveraging agency resources, dedicating staff time and energy, and helping to guide actions in a productive way. So I'd like to walk through a few of our policy approaches related to the physical aspects of restoration, but mostly focus on where we've identified areas to increase coordination and remove barriers to implementation. The Delta Reform Act calls for large-scale restoration projects that restore ecosystem process, reconnect habitat, and provide complexity, diversity, and redundancy. Restoration projects should also strive to support the cultural values of the Delta and incorporate recreation and societal benefit as a part of that design. This proposed approach sets up a tiering system for classification of restoration projects to allow for greater disclosure of project attributes, societal benefit, and then tracking of performance overall. This approach also leverages existing recovery and conservation plans and includes the new Bay Delta Water Quality Control Board flow objectives once they're adopted. So good project design and implementation in our context relies heavily on adaptive management, the ability to learn from the system as we implement. We're proposing an approach where the Delta Science Program will continue to play a critical role in providing science and adaptive management support through early consultations, use of best practices, and development of forums. For example, the Delta Science Program has been working over the past 3 years to convene a group called the Interagency Adaptive Management, Interagency Adaptive Management Integration Team, or IAMIT. It's a forum that's modeled after an existing one in the Sassoon Marsh called the Sassoon Marsh AMAT, as a coordination venue for local, state, and federal agency staff to discuss topics ranging from permitting, project design, and monitoring and adaptive management. In a 2017 survey of Dpic committee members and staff, inefficiency in the permitting process was identified as a major barrier to implementing the eco-restore projects. Since then, as a part of these committee meetings, we've been highlighting where new programs can create more efficiency and simplify the path from design to construction. Dpic supported efforts on a statewide restoration permitting initiative, a collaborative effort between the Army Corps of Engineers, the NOAA Restoration Center, National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, State Water Resources Control Board to develop coordinated programmatic authorizations for restoration projects. With the support of the Council, California Natural Resources Agency, DWR, state parks, foundations, and other organizations, and a grant through the State Coastal Conservancy, a group, Sustainable Conservation, it's a nonprofit organization, is providing technical assistance to these agencies to develop statewide U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service programmatic biological opinion and a State Water Resources Control Board general order for a common set of for permitting a common set of restoration types with high statewide priority. Authorizations have already been issued for the National Marine Fisheries Service and the Coastal Commission statewide, and so far over 150 projects have been permitted to date, and there's continued demand. The goal is to have the remaining authorizations completed by the end of 2020. So these permits are really expected to benefit projects that are wide-ranging, from eco-restore projects, Prop 1, Prop 68, GGRF, Measure AA, and they'd be beneficial for non-flow restoration projects that may result from voluntary agreements in the Delta, Sacramento, and San Joaquin valleys. In addition, Bay Delta, BCDC's Bay Restoration and Integration Team, BRIT, and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Regional Conservation Investment Strategy provide valuable lessons learned and efficiencies for project proponents. We know currently that there's a mismatch in funding available for restoration and estimates of what is needed to achieve the restoration targets laid out in recovery plans. Our proposed approach would convene agencies and experts to help identify long-term resources and funding mechanisms needed to support project implementation, including reconnaissance studies, project design, land acquisition, and management. Dpic can assist by providing leadership to help explore a portfolio of options for future funding, whether through federal interest, future bonds, or dedicated state funding. And while the funding gap might be daunting, there are examples of success. Today you're going to hear more about Measure AA and a little bit more about Prop 1 and how those are creating successes for restoration projects. Dpic has been a really important venue for making progress on restoration work. Our work has identified that continued leadership and engagement at the highest levels of government, combined with flexible arrangements and the ability to partner with local and non-governmental agencies, is a key ingredient to success. Implementation of restoration projects is hard work, as many of you know, with lots of twists and turns along the way. The role of Dpic would be to enhance problem-solving capacity at the highest level to reduce those barriers to implementation. This amended Chapter 4 will set up core strategies, policies, and recommendations with the reporting mechanisms, but the work of achieving the targets and taking action on management strategies to remove barriers of implementation can be more successful with the engagement of this committee. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to our other panelists to hear about successful implementation, both lessons learned from the Bay Area and from the Delta. We've got time for discussion at the end.
Before we start, is the hum from the audio, pardon? Oh, the air conditioner, okay, thank you.
And where do I see my slides? And then this button here. Okay. Good afternoon, Implementation Committee members. Thank you for having me. My name is Adrian Covert. I'm Vice President of Public Policy at the Bay Area Council. The Bay Area Council is a regional business association, been located in San Francisco since it was founded in 1945. And the council was co-chair for the Measure AA campaign. And so I'm happy to come here today and share with you some of the lessons that we learned in that campaign and see if maybe any of those lessons could be applied to the Delta. So I'm going to give you a brief history of what AA was, and then we'll talk a little bit about the coalition that made it possible. First, Measure AA, just the basics, was a 9-county ballot measure, the first of its kind, first time that all residents of the 9-county Bay Area voted on the same thing. It was on the June 2016 ballot, and it passed with over 70% support, and with majority support of voters in all of the 9 counties, and supermajority support in several of the counties. It being a tax measure did require a 2/3 majority to pass. It approved a $12 parcel tax on every parcel in the 9 counties, and it's estimated to raise $500 million over 20 years. And that money will be granted by the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority for projects that fit the Measure AA and also fall within the jurisdiction of the authorizing legislation that created the Restoration Authority in 2008. So next I'm going to show a timeline because I think this, hopefully you have a clearer version of this. This gives a good idea of how we built the coalition and the timeline for getting to Measure AA. I think one of the very first important steps began in 1999 with the release of the Habitat Goals Report. This was put together primarily by the Coastal Conservancy, but it had many other partners, and it included the scientific estimate that we needed 100,000 acres of functional tidal wetlands in San Francisco Bay to have a healthy ecosystem. That would be down from the historic 230,000 acres prior to the gold rush, but up from the 30,000 or so acres that remained as of the 1960s. So 100,000 acres is the target. Several years later, Senator Feinstein was able to negotiate a purchase, below market rate purchase from Cargill for several of Cargill's salt ponds in the South Bay. That involved the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, the Resources Legacy Fund, and several other environmental philanthropic organizations. That was for over 16,000 acres of formerly salt-producing wetlands to be restored. However, there was no money to actually do the restoration work. An estimate at the time figured that restoring those 16,000 acres would cost about $1.5 billion. And where that money would come from, we did not know. So we went to work, led by Save the Bay, an environmental advocacy group based in Oakland that focuses on the health and safety and accessibility of the San Francisco Bay. Legislation was passed in 2009, creating the San Francisco Bay Restoration Authority. The Restoration Authority was authorized to put a ballot measure before all 9 county voters or some portion thereof to create funding, regional funding for wetland restoration projects, flood protection projects if they were part of a restoration project, pollution prevention projects, and expanding public access to the San Francisco Bay shoreline. With that authority created, however, there needed to be a coalition put together to determine what that measure would look like. So in 2012, the Bayland Steering Committee was created, and that involved the Resources Legacy Fund, the Bay Area Council, the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, the Santa Clara Valley Water District, Save the Bay, and some others. And our goal was to determine if we're going to be raising funds for the restoration of the San Francisco Bay wetlands while improving our flood protection, how do we do that? Where do we tax? What are we going to tax? How much? For how long? Which projects to fund? And when are we going to propose to the voters? These are all the critical questions we had to answer. And we thought that a coalition of the environmental community and the business community was the best way of coming up with not only good policy, but also a great and compelling story for the media and a good product for voters that they would support. So what we came up with was Measure AA, a $12 parcel tax that would last 20 years. A parcel tax is easily understood by voters. It's broadly based, so the threshold, the payment, the burden per individual was low. And we polled people. What we found was that people's love of the Bay transcended really where they lived. You saw more of it closer to the Bay they lived, but even farther into the periphery of the Bay, people still identified as Bay Area residents, first and foremost, in their mind, whether they drive over a bridge to get to work or they walk their dogs along the Bay. The Bay was a very powerful message, and the message that we hadn't taken the best care of the Bay since the gold rush, but we now have an opportunity to leave it in a better position for our kids and grandkids really resonated. So that was the message that we took to voters in 2016 during a high turnout presidential primary election in June 2016, and we were able to pass the measure. Before we got to the measure, however, there were 2 other key steps that I think were critical to our coalition and to our success. One was the Bay Area Council Economic Institute did a study that found, that looked at the current economic vulnerabilities of an extreme weather event in the 9-county Bay Area. So we worked with AECOM and the Bay Area flood protection agencies, and we came up with an estimate of about $10.5 billion of expected economic damage, conservative estimated economic damage if a 150-year storm event were to strike the Bay Area. This was about a year or two after Hurricane Sandy hit New York, so this was on people's minds. As I mentioned, the Bay Area Council had already been part of this steering committee, but in order to get success at the ballot, we needed to make sure the Bay Area Council's business members and the members of the Silicon Valley Leadership Group were bought in. So we did this analysis that showed, without sea level rise, what is the vulnerability today? It was at $10.5 billion, and we were made the case that $1.5 billion would go a long way to saving and protecting most of our shared infrastructure along the Bay shoreline. So we circulated the findings of that report. We got a lot of media attention out of it, despite there being a drought calling for more flood protection. And we also got some fantastic corporate support for the Measure AA campaign, the two largest of which were PG&E and Facebook very generously. At the same time, there was also a public education campaign called Our Bay on the Brink that was putting billboards up along Highway 101 that told commuters that during the next megastorm, this freeway would be flooded and you'd have to find a different way to work. And strategies like that helped get the word out and alert the public to the risks of sea level rise and extreme weather events. And all of these things came together on June 16th to pass Measure AA. This is the final coalition of the steering committee for the campaign. A great mix of environmental and business organizations, as we had sought to create from the get-go. One thing I didn't put on here, but is extremely important, I think, for our success, was our tremendous outreach that we were able to do with our campaign consultant to the editorial boards of Bay Area newspapers. We had unanimous endorsements from the Bay Area newspapers very early on. We think that was critical to reaching key demographics, particularly in the rural parts of the Bay Area in the North and the East Bay. So I hope some of those provide some good lessons, and I'm happy to answer questions and participate in the panel discussion as we go. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for having me. I'm Caitlin Sweeney, the director of the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. It's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Adrian did a great job of giving the background of Measure AA and touched on the Restoration Authority, and I just want to build on that and talk about now that it's passed, now that we have some money coming in, how is the Restoration Authority working, what is the process, how are we continuing to build on that great effort to build that coalition to make sure that we are successful going forward. So I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about how the Restoration Authority is structured. So it has a governing board. These are 7 members, all elected officials from Bay cities or counties or special districts, park districts, or open space districts. And essentially their mandate is to receive and disperse funds for projects in the Bay Area. Okay. So to staff the authority is staffed by staff from the State Coastal Conservancy, as well as the San Francisco Estuary Partnership. So rather than going out and finding brand new staff, hiring executive director, trying to figure out how to do that, the authority took advantage of existing staff who'd been working on a volunteer basis to staff the authority well before Measure AA actually provided funds. And the executive director of the Coastal Conservancy serves as the executive director of the Restoration Authority. And then we also have another player in the room, the Association of Bay Area Governments, which appoints the governing board members and then also serves as the treasurer to the authority to really keep those finances separate and make sure the finances don't go through the state, which, as you can imagine, would have some challenges. And then for anyone who doesn't know, the Estuary Partnership has actually been a program of the Association of Bay Area Governments, or ABAG, for many years. So we have traditionally been ABAG employees. Now staff of ABAG has merged with the staff of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission under one executive director of MTC. So that's bringing another regional agency to the table. So now essentially MTC is the treasurer of the governing board, just to make the kitchen more crowded, but we're bringing all the important regional agencies to the table here. A really critical component of the authority and how the authority is working now is that we have a very robust and rather large advisory committee, 32-member advisory committee. 32 members currently, it could be larger. And their job is just that, to advise the authority on all aspects, from large-scale programmatic aspects to really digging into the grant guidelines, for example. And the folks on the advisory committee represent a wide diversity of backgrounds and interests and skills and experience. Adrian sits on that as well. Really, again, carrying forward that coalition and making sure that we keep that connection to the community and those people who are funding the authority, and engaging them and bringing to the table in a very meaningful way. The Conservancy provides the base staff for that. And then we also have a Citizens Oversight Committee, another critical component. This comes from the legislation itself. 6 members reviewing the authority's expenditures, the audits, the financials, making sure that the authority is spending money in adherence with the law and Measure AA. And then lastly, Jessica touched on this, the Bay Restoration Regional, I'll get it wrong, Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, or the BRIT. So this is bringing yet another 6 agencies to the table to really have a coordinated, comprehensive approach to reviewing and permitting restoration authority or even restoration authority eligible projects. So the BRIT is composed as the top 6 regulatory agencies in the area who have authority over restoration projects, and who will be physically co-located in the same room, at least for a couple days a week, to dig in and review authority projects together. And then there's a higher level project management team that will dig into the more sticky, wicket, longer term policy issues that come up. I wanted to go through this quickly. These are the proposal scoring categories for a proposal that is coming forward to the authority for potential funding. These are the categories based on the Measure AA and the authorizing legislation by which a project is analyzed. And I wanted to list these out just to show you how diverse they are. So you can see, the project has to implement one or more activities of the measure, as Adrian already said. That's about water and pollution prevention, fish and wildlife habitat, flood protection, or public access. And then there's categories about the likelihood of success. But then you see on the other side these programmatic priorities. And these cover really a wide variety of categories. Everything from what you would expect, so the grade of positive impact to the Bay, to other potentially more localized categories, such as whether a project benefits disadvantaged communities, really engages youth, benefits the economy. So what this does is it allows the authority to, within, again, the confines of the legislation and Measure AA, to fund a real wide variety of restoration, flood protection, and public access projects. So not only the really big splashy South Bay Salt Pond restoration projects, but some of the smaller, more urban projects that may provide, really critical key corridor for wildlife, but also very critical opportunities for the local communities for open space and recreational opportunities. So I think that's provided the authority with a lot of great flexibility, which allows them to fund. This is a showing of the first round of funded projects, allows them to fund this diversity of projects both geographically. There's planning projects in there as well as implementation. There's small urban projects, and there's large open space, sort of typical wetland restoration projects in there. A really nice mix of projects that the authority can be quite proud of going forward. So this is round 1 funded projects. They were funded last year. They're all getting started now. Staff is currently reviewing applications for round 2 of projects, and we'll be bringing forward recommendations to the authority later this year for round 2 of funding. But I just want to give you a sense of the kinds of projects that are being funded, and to emphasize again that there's a lot of people on this train. It's really important that there's a lot of people on this train, especially now that the train is moving and gaining speed. We're all really excited to be working together over the next 18 years now to see what we can do and what kind of positive impacts we can make on the Bay together. With that, I will turn it over. Thank you.
Chair Tatayan and council members, nice to be here today and provide you with the next round of the Eco Restore Initiative update for you. I'm somewhat nervous to give this presentation because I was not able to join the last Dpic, and so DWR Eco Restore staff, Charlotte Biggs, stepped up and gave the presentation, and afterwards I got no less than a half a dozen texts and emails on how well she had done, so I know the bar is very high today. So I'll touch on some similar themes. Is there a PowerPoint coming up? Oh, thank you. Technology challenged. So I'll touch on some similar themes that you've heard us speak to in the past. So first, there's a lot of information on this slide, but I want to bring us all the way back to the beginning and what the original goal for the Eco Restore initiative was. So we're in year 4 of what was anticipated as a 5-year initiative. The overall goal for the initiative was 30,000 acres of habitat restoration or enhancement by 2020. So the finish line is in sight. It's a little far off still, but we can see it. So just a quick timeline of where we are currently. Part of, I guess for a little bit of context as well, part of what the initiative was all about was really trying to help a series of projects get to construction that were having a difficult time in doing so. Before the creation of the initiative, DWR's Division of Environmental Services provided a lot of work and foundation in trying to get these projects to the finish line. They are charged with getting about 90% of these projects to completion. Other partners also participated through programs such as CalFed. So a lot of these projects have a long history, but they've just had a really hard time getting to construction. So a big part of the initiative is actually trying to figure out why. And that story is probably a little variable for each of the individual projects, but there are definitely some themes that emerge that I'll touch on in a bit. But to give that status of where we are now, so in the very top right corner, we've got a series of projects that are into construction as of last year. In 2019, we foresee 2 projects breaking ground. That was 4 projects for a little while. 2 have fallen off the list and moved into 2020. So if you look at that next box on the far right, that's a pretty big stack. But we do believe that we're going to be able to get all those projects to groundbreaking by 2020, but for maybe 1 or 2 of those project sites. I want to pause here for a second and look at that long list, because back in 2017, before I joined the Eco Restore Initiative, I understand that the Eco Restore Initiative came to this group and highlighted the need for support in all the various permitting that these projects require. And I just want to kind of flag that we will probably need to do that again with this long of a list that we're going to try and get to groundbreaking by 2020. I think we're going to need to check back in with all the regulatory agencies on the status of where all these permitting efforts are for the individual projects. So stay tuned for a check-in on that. And then the last batch down in the lower right-hand corner is all the ones that we've actually moved to construction. So acreage-wise, to summarize, we've got about 2,800 acres that are complete and complete in the ground. We've got about another 3,500 acres that are in active construction. And where are the rest of those projects in the process? So this next slide is kind of a generalized representation of the process of what it takes to get these projects from concept to completion. So the whole point of sharing this slide is to show that, you know, all these projects start off on that left side and we're trying to move them over to the right side. So thankfully, as the initiative has moved forward, more and more projects are making it over to that right side and towards completion. But you can see in that middle section, restoration planning, design, permitting, this is where a lot of them are stacked up right now. And this is where the work and the effort really gets complicated. And this is a helpful segue to kind of this institutional barriers theme and what we've learned over time and what are the challenges to getting these things to completion. So a couple of examples that I'll touch on. This is all in the spirit of trying to move off of these one-off solutions, project by project, really going towards programmatic approaches. So you all have heard a lot about programmatic permitting. Jessica mentioned it in the beginning. That can take a whole variety of forms. one example that I would offer here for the conflicts that we run into that we didn't even really know would be conflicts are, if one agency is charged with maximizing public use and access for each one of these sites, but another agency is charged with managing these sites for the most ecological benefit that we could bring to listed species. Well, public use and access and listed species don't always come together as well as we might like. So how can we actually start looking at that on a programmatic basis? There are a few other efforts along those lines as well. Developing more dynamic contracting and acquisition processes. This is one of the steps that was really holding things up. So one of the solutions here was to open an RFP to bring the private sector into project delivery and engage more folks in this to help in that bottleneck. I could offer another potential solution here, and this stuff gets pretty weedy, but one of the things we might need to look at are possible legislative fixes where typically the way contracting works now in project delivery is one entity designs the project and then another entity builds the project. So that leads to a lot of cost overruns, inefficiencies, change orders. So one of the things to do would be to build in more continuity in that type of a process. Increasing collaboration between project proponents and regulatory agencies. I guess an example that I would offer here is one of the basic tenets for EcoRestore was to set up these regional planning forums where local communities could really be brought in, managers of water infrastructure could be brought in, agricultural representatives could be brought in to really try and figure out within the very complicated context of the Delta, how can we all come together in these planning forums and figure out how to move these projects forward. So an example that I would provide here is the YOLO Cash partnership, started under the auspices of an MOU signed a few years ago. That effort has matured since then into formulation of a management committee and then a series of subgroups under that management committee that are working on issues that are specific to that geography. And we're going to need more of this. And then the last one that I would touch on is long-term operations and maintenance. I'm sure a lot of you are hearing repeated reference to that. We had some initial success with being able to secure some funding along these lines. These habitat projects are state assets, so we need to make sure that we've also got the long-term investment to make sure that they're functioning in the way that we need them to. So we're able to secure some initial funding along these lines, but now where the effort is to think through very carefully how to best put a program together, how much of this type of work is contracted out versus done in-house among the agencies, how are those dollars best spent on which sites, et cetera. So there's a lot of thought going into that right now is how best to set that program up before we look for additional funds. And this work is going to continue beyond even the EcoRestore initiative, whatever it becomes called, whether the initiative itself goes beyond 2020. This type of work on the institutional barrier front is pretty complicated and it's going to take a long time. So we're going to be at that for a little while. And I want to finish off on public outreach. So this Dpic forum provides an important outreach forum. We did a whole lot more in 2018 along those lines as well. Going back about a year now to last March, we started a media campaign to try and get the word out on EcoRestore progress and what it even was and what we were working on. So all the way back in March, we started with the groundbreaking at the Fremont Weir Fish Passage project, where we were able to provide new passage in a flood control facility for the first time in 100 years. We then conducted a series of groundbreakings. Each of those groundbreakings had a video and a blog to try and help spread the word on those projects. Most recently, we had a groundbreaking at Dutch Slough to try and wrap up the year with that event. And then finally, so those are all the kind of project by project levels, we wanted to finish off this campaign with an EcoRestore video where we could pull in some of the partners and tell the whole story of what the initiative really was about. We had full intentions of trying to do this in 2018. We didn't quite pull that off. We literally weren't actually sure whether the video would even be done this morning, but I'm happy to report that the video is done. So if we can tee that up, you all are getting the first debut of the EcoRestore video.
Remember, everyone, you saw it here first.
Maybe, hopefully.
The delta of today is highly changed from what it was naturally. Back in the 1800s, before the gold rush and the resulting population boom in the state, the delta was a dynamic and wild system of tidal wetlands, riparian forests, and vast seasonal floodplains. As the The delta of today is highly changed from what it was naturally. Back in the 1800s, before the gold rush and the resulting population boom in the state, the delta was a dynamic and wild system of tidal wetlands, riparian forests, and vast seasonal floodplains. As the state has developed, we've lost these critical habitats at alarming rates. The real loss has been to our aquatic and terrestrial ecosystems, the native fish, birds, and wildlife that depend on these habitats to survive.
The significance of the delta extends well beyond its legal boundaries. It's the heart of California's water supply and serves millions of residents, agricultural lands, and businesses all the way from the Bay Area to San Diego. Our health, the health of the environment, and the security of our water supply all depend on this delta.
California is the 5th largest economy on Earth. And what's that economy run on? It runs on water. So why would someone, in one of our big cities care about fish or levees in the upper Sacramento Valley? And the answer is simple, because with updated water infrastructure, we have a functioning river system. And a functioning river system means that we have robust, healthy populations of fish. And that means that we're better able to pass water to our farms and to our cities and have a more secure water supply for California and California's economy.
The EcoRestore initiative began 3 years ago as a means of placing additional emphasis on some long-standing project implementation needs. The goal was simple and ambitious: 30,000 acres of habitat restoration and enhancement within 5 years. This is basically a doubling of the amount of habitat that's out there on the ground now. In 2018, the initiative and all the partners it collaborates with broke ground on 5 projects that stretch 70 miles across the Delta. These projects remove barriers to fish migration that have been in place for 100 years, establish new tidal and wetland habitats, and increase the amount of forest along our rivers for birds and other species as well.
DWR is the lead agency on the majority of EcoRestore projects, and that simply reflects DWR's ongoing commitment both to our mitigation responsibilities that are connected to the long-term operations of the state and federal water project, but also our obligation and our responsibility to pursue habitat restoration for habitat restoration's sake. We're not striving just towards 30,000 acres of restoration. Acreage is great, but if you're a fish, if you're an upland mammal, if you're a bird, what you really care about is ecosystem function. And that's truly what we're going for through the EcoRestore program. It's how all these projects link together on the landscape with what's already out there and what's planned for the future.
With EcoRestore, it created a situation where it was a priority for the state. It wasn't just an agency within the state, it was a statewide mandate to get this habitat restoration done. And that makes all the difference in the world. It creates a situation where everybody's working more closely together and with a common purpose. And so I think maintaining a program like EcoRestore is a critical factor. Without that, we go back to what we saw before EcoRestore, where things just kind of move along gradually and don't happen very quickly, if at all.
Not only is EcoRestore providing a common purpose for the department, but it's prompting us to take an important look at how we implement our habitat restoration in the Delta. Integration of ecological principles into project planning, design, and operations is critical to the work that we do. And nowhere is that integration more important than here in the Delta.
So the Delta Conservancy has a dual role, essentially, to do ecosystem restoration as well as economic development in the Delta. And one of the things that we strive to do is integrate the local interest and voice into the planning for restoration in the Delta over time.
The Nature Conservancy has been active in the Delta for about 20 years.
And it's really interesting within that 20 years what we've learned. And so the question is, what do we do moving forward? And the Nature Conservancy or the state are not going to be able to do this by themselves. As we see on McCormick, Williamson, and other projects, it's going to be a partnership. It has to be a partnership between landowners, the state, the Nature Conservancy, and other organizations that work in the Delta.
Perhaps the most valuable aspect of the initiative is the alignment among California's conservation leaders. This alignment leads to prioritization of scarce resources towards these priority projects and demonstrated on-the-ground results.
When you study ecology and you design a restoration project, it forces you to ask, what did the site used to look like? So we developed this idea, along with the Department of Water Resources, of multi-benefit flood management projects that not only provide flood risk reduction benefits, but at the same time give more room to the river.
The Delta is unique in so many ways. Home to historic towns, generations of Californians, vibrant agriculture, treasured for a range of recreational opportunities. It's also a biodiversity hotspot, the largest estuary in the Western Americas and home to hundreds of species. At the same time, it's a microcosm of the challenges we face in California, including climate change and its impacts on our natural environment, as well as ecosystem decline. Eco-Restore is a big idea and an ambitious approach to address these challenges head-on, and it represents the type of win-win strategy that we need in California. How do we restore and protect our environment for the benefit of fish and wildlife in ways that work for local communities? It exemplifies a new approach that Governor Newsom has talked about, which sets aside old binaries. It's not fish versus farms, it's fish and farms. It's not north versus south, it's one California. Moving forward, Eco-Restore really represents and symbolizes what we will be advancing in California, water and environmental policy that works for everyone.
So before passing the baton on, I just want to personally thank the DWR Eco-Restore staff and the Public Affairs Office for all of the work that they have put into this year-long media campaign. It's been many, many hours, many nights and weekends, so I just want to personally thank them for making this possible.
Last up. Good afternoon, Chair Tatayan and fellow members. Hello again. I'm very excited to be able to provide you an update, our first update really, on our Proposition 1 efforts. I'm going to talk about Prop 1. I'm going to talk a little bit about our recently completed regional planning effort, similar to what Mike was discussing, and then I'm going to focus a little bit on subsidence in the Delta, some unmet needs. So this is a flyer that's in your packet, and it really summarizes what we've achieved with the $50 million allocation that we have of Proposition 1 over the last 4 years. We have completed 3 cycles of restoration projects looking for ecosystem restoration, water quality, and ag sustainability projects. And through that process, we've put 19 projects out there on the landscape, awarded about $24 million. And on the right columns there, you can see the types of habitat that we're achieving with both from planning as well as implementation projects. So, and then, I'm sorry, the bottom list there is also just multi-benefit flood, multi-purpose flood benefits, as well as ag sustainability benefits. And there's a bit of overlap because some of these projects actually provide dual benefits, but we're very pleased with the acreage targets that we're achieving. And it's important to recognize that there is 5,000 acres within Eco-Restore that is to be funded through Proposition 1. So with the exception of the tidal habitat up in the upper left there, we do anticipate that these would contribute to Eco-Restore as well. We are in the final stages of Cycle 4. We're just taking all the independent review and developing staff recommendations that we'll take to the board on May 22nd for them to approve them, hopefully. And if they, we have 11 proposals for $16 million. So if they award at that level, that will about bring us to very near the end of our $50 million Prop 1 allotment. So as Mike mentioned, these regional planning strategies, well over a year ago, we wanted to bring together the public landowners within the Delta to look at how we achieve ecosystem restoration value on public lands, really for two reasons, thinking that because they're already in public ownership, there might be less obstacles to achieve restoration, but also to be responsive to a long-term Delta community cry that we ought to be doing restoration on publicly owned lands first. So what you see there is the map that is the publicly owned lands in the Delta, mostly DWR, Metropolitan Water District, and the Nature Conservancy, the bulk of those lands, and then several additional landowners, but really representing about 50,000 acres in the Delta that is in public ownership. So what we wanted to do is bring them together and really develop high-level guidance for public landowners, but also surrounding landowners. We really had excellent participation in this process. We were able to bring together all of these public landowners, many of their neighbors, the reclamation district engineers who were incredibly helpful in the process, and of course all the agencies and the NGO partners to develop this approach. We also had great support from the San Francisco Estuary Institute, and I think you all have been briefed on the Delta Renewed process and the concepts that have been coming out of that process. We're really the backbone of the scientific sort of basis for what we tried to do. And then also the Catalyst Group was very helpful in facilitating all the effort. So the document is now available. It's been finalized. It, again, provides high-level guidance. On the left there, what you see is really the kind of the high-level objectives that we think were achieved. I'll refer you specifically to the second one, stop and reverse subsidence. That was just key throughout the process, recognizing the long-term agricultural viability of these islands. Again, if you look at those islands, most of them are in the deeply subsided zone of the Delta. And then the map on the right is really a near-term look at what opportunities exist. And you'll see the habitat types there, as well as just the schematic of how we might think about these islands in the future and achieve as much ecological benefit as we can. But then also being ever mindful of the flood risk, demonstrating opportunities to increase ag sustainability and water quality, and also improve recreation. So the last slide here is sort of the longer term view, and we didn't really define how long term was, but what you see that really the fundamental difference there is you see tidal habitat moving further into the western delta. So that would indicate that this is very long term, because you'd have to do lots of subsidence reversal to actually be able to get those lands to function. But we thought it was important to complete this picture because salmonids in particular need that habitat at certain intervals. They need places for refuge and food. So in any event, the document is available on our website. Our hope is that it provides guidance to all the agencies as well as surrounding landowners about what sort of opportunities and what sort of constraints we should all be aware of as we try to get as much ecological benefit out of those lands. So I mentioned subsidence was the highest priority. I just want to refocus the discussion a little bit on subsidence. We are all aware that the delta is deeply subsided. There's between 200 and 250,000 acres that are up to 25 feet below sea level now. That is one of the most fundamental threats we have to our state and federal water supply projects in the delta, as well as all the communities and all of the agriculture. And we continue to the very practices that continue that subsidence every day. And so we're going in the wrong direction. We have sea level rise. And I say this all, but we all know this. And but I think it's important to rethink it. What maybe is somewhat new, forget the slide to advance. Oh, there it is. Now I've gone too many. Is a slightly different way of looking at the carbon emissions coming off of the delta. So that subsidence essentially is when you dry the root zone of saturated, highly organic soils for agriculture, you expose that entire soil profile to oxygen, you get microbial oxidation, and that causes volatilization and the subsidence. So when you look at that 250,000 acres, you've got a deep hole in the ground. All of that was a carbon that is essentially just jetted into the atmosphere. And so these are just different analogies, if you will, but we're currently getting somewhere between 3 and 20 metric tons of carbon per acre per year out there, simply by draining the agricultural soils. That's 2 million metric tons of carbon per year coming off the delta. That's the equivalent of about 500,000 vehicles. Interestingly, ARB recently did some analysis, and they demonstrated that that's somewhere between a quarter and a third of California's total plant-based agriculture, carbon emissions from California's total plant-based agriculture. So that's 25 million arable acres in California, and here in the Delta, 250,000 acres are 1% of that land mass is putting out between a quarter and a third of the carbon emissions. Another really interesting note is that the ARB and California Natural Resource Agency just recently put out the Natural and Working Land Strategy. And it shows that over a 12-year period, if you do best practices for all of California's natural and working lands, that's better forest management, agricultural management, grasslands, shrublands, everything you can do over a 12-year period will result in 53 million metric tons of carbon reduction in the atmosphere. That's a great thing, but at 2 million metric tons per year from the Delta in that same 12-year period, you're going to get 26 million metric tons in addition. So again, the focus is this is an enormous chimney that is just forcing carbon into the atmosphere, excuse me, as fast and hard as it can, and that's combined with the risk that we all understand that subsidence represents to everything that we all talk about in terms of the water supply of California. So a couple quick points. We do have an American Carbon Registry approved methodology that allows you to change practice, resaturate the soil through managed wetlands and or rice cultivation. We're working with public and private landowners to develop pilot projects. We're working with carbon financiers who are convinced that on the voluntary market, they can market as much carbon as we can verify in the Delta. But essentially what we're really lacking at this point, and what I'm hoping, connecting to the funding need, is the funds basically to get out there and help people do land conversion to different practices. ARB is very interested in including this protocol, the voluntary market protocol, in the ARB compliance program in the future, and that becomes very important when you start to really look at economic incentives. So I won't go through this, but if you look at that voluntary carbon, and you can see how the carbon market works a little bit, but at a price of $7 per credit, we can generate about $59 per acre in the Delta, in this deeply subsided area of the Delta right now. That's not much of an incentive, but getting it into the compliance market bumps that price up to $19 a credit, and that gets you a net of $183 an acre. Now that is very competitive with corn, the corn return that farmers in the Delta would anticipate. And then there's well-documented analysis that the expectation that the market very likely will go at least to $30 an acre, and that puts us at $300 an acre return. So you see where we have a market mechanism, we have significant threats, significant carbon emissions, and the opportunity for folks to come together and have a market mechanism really drive the change that we really need to see in the Western Delta. So I think it's very exciting and interesting stuff. And, my last slide. Anyway, you might be able to see my last slide in hard copy, but it's a very large piece of infrastructure, a bridge sticking out of a flooded island in the Delta. So I'll leave it at that, and really appreciate the opportunity to give you all an update on what we're up to.
Thanks to all of our panelists. There's certainly a really compelling story here about restoration efforts that are happening in the Delta. Dpic has been a really important venue for outreach and communication and removing some of those barriers to implementation, especially when it comes to simplified or more efficiency in permitting. We'd like to hear thoughts and feedback from the committee members, and also feedback on how we as agencies and agency staff can help to focus on some of these issues. Where are the big barriers to implementation that we can get together, try and identify priorities, and then bring back solutions to this committee. So happy to have discussion and questions for the panelists.
So Dpic members, Clyde?
Yeah. Campbell, I really didn't understand your last chart on potential income. Are these potential incomes or costs? I mean, maybe just to understand this, we've got $59, $183, and $304. Which one of is better? I mean, are we trying to drive to get to $304 as a net revenue per acre? Or are we trying to get to voluntary at $59 where it's really, anyway?
Sure. So currently we're at we have an approved protocol on the voluntary market that will realize that $59 per acre. So the farmer converts land, they do the validation verification, and they can take, I forget, 15 credits to market, and that results in that net amount.
So that's a net to him.
That is a net to the farmer. That exceeds revenue that certain agencies are getting in terms of their lease value on agricultural land at this point. The next bump is just essentially being able to get that protocol adopted into the California compliance program, and that's where it's mandatory and people are buying at a higher value. And then the last is just projected to where the carbon market likely would go. So it's a continuum that just shows that the potential is there to have real market incentive to make landscape scale change.
Thank you.
So this is very impressive, and a lot of people around this table, and obviously all you on the panel have been working really hard on this implementation. Can you talk a little bit about where the maintenance funding is going to come from? Because we've got, unfortunately, some examples of acquisitions with public money that are not followed up with the money required to maintain the projects after the initial funding, after the proposition money runs out, and so forth. So can you talk a little bit about how we avoid the problem of making these restoration projects financial orphans after they're created?
Yeah, so I don't know exactly how this is going to move forward, but I can at least speak to the initial success we had for Suite of the Eco Restore projects, and it was general funds. There's wide recognition that you can't use bond funding for this type of activity, whether we want to or not. So that first flush came from general funds, and I would imagine at least some portion moving forward is going to continue to need to be general funds. But I'm not real sure what the options are to create additional sources other than that.
I would just add again, looking at particularly the most deeply subsided islands, there's a lot of effort going into looking at mosaics, right? So you would look at, on a deeply subsided island, the most wettest area that's not particularly good for agriculture, you would have managed wetlands. You look at maybe rice cultivation or other higher value crops, and then some upland habitat transition area, and you're looking to those market structures to provide return mostly similar to what they're getting now, which is what is covering maintenance and cost over time. There's a lot to be sorted and put together in trying to demonstrate these, and again, the funding to help put some real pilot projects out there that really show the way is really critical.
I believe two of you mentioned permitting inefficiencies, and since this is one of our tasks here is to foster interagency cooperation between the feds and the states. I'm kind of curious as to if you can go into a little bit more detail about that. Is it duplication? Is it contradiction? Or is it sequencing? Or all the above?
I can mention a little bit about the Bay Regional Restoration Integration Team that involves 6 of the key regulatory agencies in the Bay. We did a brief analysis, and it found that certain agencies were attempting to regulate wildlife that happened to be staff expertise on a different agency, and that would send the project proponent back to the end of the line. And so there was a lot of redundancy in the process that was resulting in added time and added costs. And at the same time, the Baylands Goals Report had been updated in 2016 that showed that at the current rate of sea level rise, if we don't get wetland restoration projects in San Francisco Bay in the ground by 2030, they're going to become a lot more expensive to actually get in the ground because they're not going to be able to retain sediment at the rate they can now. So we created a system that helps coordinate multi-benefit wetland restoration and flood protection projects in San Francisco Bay that are eligible for SAA funding, but prior to even being approved for AA funding, just to make sure that projects that the Bay needs on a very short timeline because of the new climate reality that we're facing can get that fast track without burdening other projects in the Bay. So we're funding a separate a lane for them. And Caitlin might want to elaborate on that.
Just to add, another issue for some regulatory agencies who have laws on the books that predate what we know now about how our system is changing and climate changing, and so they are individually going through processes. BCDC is a good example of looking at their policies to see how they might need to change their policies to allow for some of the more innovative, creative, multi-benefit adaptation projects. In BCDC's case, it's about allowing fill in the Bay, for example, for restoration projects. The San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board is also going through a similar process. So there's individual agency processes as well as the efficiencies I think we'll see through the BRIT.
I think one other aspect to that is the work that the Dpic committee and individual members have supported for sustainable conservation, where they're looking at statewide and regional permits. So you're still creating that permitting structure, and Maria, maybe you have more to add on this, but it's creating a structure where you're identifying up to 15 project types that are sort of high priority restoration types, and creating structures around permitting for those types so that when they do come forward, there's more efficiency. I think and Maria, I'll let you talk about it in more detail.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, we've been able to partner well with Sustainable Conservation. They've been super helpful in terms of working with the regulatory agencies, and so we're using our new programmatic regulations under the Endangered Species Act to permit a wide range of restoration projects. So when those individual projects come through, they already are covered from Endangered Species Act. So that's been a really successful model for us. We've had our No Restoration Center in the lead on that as well. It's been implemented for years up and down the coast, and so that's something we've recently been able to bring into the Central Valley.
So Dpic members, we are running a little late. It is 4 minutes to 4, and I have a question for you. Are you willing to stay another 5 minutes to hear the update from John? Yes, okay, great. So is there any other discussion on this panel? I think that we were going to discuss some possible lessons we can take from the Bay Area efforts. In addition to the permitting, is there anything else that folks are noticing we could take away from the Bay Area example? Campbell?
Well, I certainly wanted to steer us in the direction of a lot of conversation of late about trying to get a work group that really starts to focus on all of these issues. We've recently been meeting in a small group of agencies trying to help provide information and guidance on the Chapter 4 update from the agency perspective. And it's what we recognize is that we don't do that often enough. And there's a whole host of these issues that are identified in this segment of key questions and challenges that we all face. And so what we would suggest is we would like to actually start to pull that together on a fairly regular basis, try to articulate a vision and the suite of activities that group will try to coordinate and make progress on, and then bring it back to Dpic at the next meeting with a suggestion of maybe an organization and a charter, and how we might build that group out to be representative of all the Dpic members. But certainly from my experience in the Delta, when we pull people who are doing restoration together to have those conversations, it's very valuable and something that we would all benefit from.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Campbell. The department has been involved in that group. We convened something similar. We developed a Delta Conservation Framework. It's been continuing, and I would say it's very productive, so we would be supportive of continuing to do that and scoping out what we might bring to the next Dpic meeting.
Okay, I'm hearing that we are going to have a consolidated work group, and are you asking the Dpic leadership to endorse this work group?
Certainly think we could go a couple of ways. I think what we're suggesting is we'll come together and we'll start to define, what we think this group can do and the value it can add, and bring a report back to Dpic at the next meeting, at which point there might be an option for Dpic to say this is actually a subgroup of Dpic, elevate it to that level. This is sort of my construct. I think we're all somewhat in agreement, but so sort of informal at this point. Let's get together and have some discussions and try to put some structure and direction to it, and then report back to Dpic.
Okay, great, thank you. Terrific, okay. Would you, we are planning a July 2019 Dpic deep dive. Do you think the work group would be prepared by July, or do you prefer November for floating the charter? And
my sense is that we ought to have our first meeting next month, and maybe one every month after that, and we'll have something by that time. We'll see how far we get.
By November?
Yep.
Okay.
No, I'm sorry, by July.
By July,
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, at least if nothing else, a quick summary of the meetings that we've had and the topics we've discussed and where we see it going.
Okay. Terrific, thank you. Well, with that, we'll move on to the update from John Callaway.
Great. I wanted to give you an update on nutria issues, and actually I wanted to call up Valerie Cook-Fletcher, who is here and who's the new incident command leader from California Department of Fish and Wildlife on nutria. So I think at our last meeting, there was a lot of interest and discussion about the challenge of nutria. I guess you could say nutria is by far the highest profile non-native invasive species in the Delta, maybe in the state, definitely potential for very significant impacts to infrastructure, to wetlands, to wildlife. And so given the concerns about nutria at the last Dpic meeting, there was a request to put together a work group so that we could look at what the challenges are for collaboration and coordination around the effort to control nutria. So that work group has met 2 times. Amanda Bohl has been facilitating that. Simultaneously with that group, California Department of Fish and Wildlife and others, CDFA, California Food and Ag, as well as USDA, and the Department of Water Resources were meeting to do some sort of on-the-ground coordination of those outreach or the control efforts. And then Campbell Ingram and I have both been participating in the last 2 meetings. Those are monthly interagency coordination meetings. So I think there's definitely been significant progress in the coordination and much better on-the-ground coordination in terms of California Department of Food and Ag, really from their expertise in monitoring and evaluating pest impacts. They're really looking at mapping the extent of the nutria infestation within the state, and then California Department of Fish and Wildlife is really looking at control efforts, and they've definitely improved that linkage. And so I want to ask Valerie is going to give us an update on exactly where the status of things are today with nutria control. And I think you have slides. If you could go back to the slides.
Okay, thank you, John. Before I jump into an update on where we are with eradication efforts, I want to provide some context here. Last month, 2 years ago, last month was the date that nutria were detected in California, and then 1 year ago, last month is when the department responded by instituting the incident command system, redirecting staff and resources from throughout multiple regions to provide the resources to implement eradication efforts for nutria. So since that time of instituting the incident command system, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, along with project partners, Department of Food and Agriculture and USDA's Wildlife Services, we've conducted full or rapid assessments on over 300,000 acres throughout the multi-county region. We've obtained access from over 2,400 private landowners to be able to come onto their properties for purposes of surveys and nutria removals. The invasive species program has received now over 360 nutria reports from the general public throughout the state, confirming only 7 of those to date. We've deployed over 550 camera stations throughout the region and conducted 1,771 camera checks, confirming nutria in 128, now 129 different locations throughout the region. We've deployed 1,036 traps for a total of over 14,000 trap nights, and ultimately removed, after making this PowerPoint, we've now removed 416 nutria. So as you can see the breakdown by county, over 330 of those in Merced and 65 of those in San Joaquin County. So to look at the distribution of those 416 animals taken, we're still working within the 6-county region. So Fresno, Stanislaus, Merced, and San Joaquin counties, as well as Mariposa and a confirmed detection in Tuolumne. When we look at the distribution of those animals and the densities of where they've been taken, this represents that the vast majority of those animals have been taken in Merced County. If you look at San Joaquin and within the legal delta boundaries, this detection, where you can see the highlighted red cells, April of 2018 is when the first animal was detected within the legal delta boundary that was just near the confluence of the Old River and the San Joaquin River. In September of last year, animals were detected and a breeding population was confirmed within Walthall Slough. Since that time, 64 animals have been removed from Walthall Slough, with additional animals continuing to be removed. Friday, we had another confirmed detection you'll have to look at the screen up here, just in a backwater right off of the San Joaquin River. So again, very near Walthall Slough, but another location for us to focus on in terms of trapping and removing that breeding population. In looking forward, we are working with the Interagency Ecological Program. They're conducting habitat suitability modeling for us using the project data to help us prioritize areas throughout the Delta for allocation of our resources in terms of survey efforts. The department submitted a budget change proposal and received potential funding in the governor's draft budget. That funding passed the Assembly Budget Subcommittee last month and now moves on to the full Assembly. That funding provides 10 positions to provide leadership for a dedicated department program and a portion of permanent field staff while we pursue broader program staffing positions for expanded efforts through grant funding. We have a pending grant proposal in with Delta Conservancy right now. Those funding sources will also allow for integration of additional methodologies, including Judas Nutria and Nutria detector dog teams. Additional funding opportunities that have come up. Federal budget requests are moving forward. The Association of California Ag Commissioners has a lobbyist who is pushing for federal funding in DC. That was prompted and comes on the heels of Quirk's joint resolution AJR 8 that was introduced to urge Congress to add California to the Federal Nutria Eradication and Control Act. They're requesting funding in the amount of $5.4 million per year to provide full program funding for the department, its partners, CDFA and Wildlife Services, and integration of those dog teams. Quirk's office also recently introduced AB 1612, which would establish the Invasive Species Response Fund for vertebrate invasive species and would serve as a mechanism to receive those federal dollars and continuously appropriate to the effort. I would like to remind you all that additional program updates can always be found at the department's Nutria Incident webpage, which is, you'll see on the screen, wildlife.ca.gov/nutria. And other updates include the Delta Stewardship Council also recently developed a pocket identification guide that they printed, I believe, 25,000 of those, which have pretty well flown off the shelves to the public and agency staff throughout the Delta. and out through the infested area. DWR, I believe, is contributing with another 25,000 printing, and those are being spoken for as well. And with that, I'll take any questions that you may have.
So it's an impressive response, but the question I have after seeing all those numbers is, are we gaining on them, or are they gaining on us?
At this point, the numbers have been pretty stable so far. We believe that down in Merced County in the grasslands, we are probably losing a little bit of ground right now, to be honest. We have been functioning entirely with partially redirected staff. So in the grasslands, we know that it's prime habitat for as far as the eye can see. We still have breeding populations throughout the San Joaquin River and the Merced River, and tons and tons of habitat right now in Merced County. So the reality is that right now we have source populations that we know are breeding that we do not have the manpower to get to. In the Delta, we're currently working in the vicinity of Wall Falls Slough, Tom Paine Slough, Old River, and up through the Port of Stockton. We have had no additional detections further north in the Delta than the Lathrop area, but the reality is we have source populations upstream that we are not able to deal with yet. So that really stresses the importance of us being able to obtain secure and long-term funding to get dedicated boots on the ground and more boots on the ground so that we can finally make that progress to get in the lead.
Is there a cost estimate for eradication of nutria?
We have put together cost estimates for annual costs for the program, but the reality is we have not put out a total estimate because our reality is we are still figuring out the full extent of what we're dealing with. And another component of that is with invasive species, the harder you can jump on it early on, the better off you are, because the further that this population progresses, the more reproduction is occurring, the more animals, the longer amount of time, the more costs. So our reality is if we can jump on this thing hard, do a really great job very quickly, then the project is not going to require us being out on the landscape for as long and not cost quite as much. But we're all kind of subject to the amount of funding that comes through, the amount of bodies that we get on the ground.
And Valerie, when we were talking last week, she was saying that you guys are already doing a lot to be prepared, assuming that the BCP comes through, that you'll be able to hire people quickly and get them out in the field as soon as possible so that you can reduce the population quickly rather than waiting around.
Yeah, the BCP will provide funding to start a program on July 1, but with the staff, the time it will take to staff that program up and the subsequent grant funding to come through to expand those operations, we'll continue the ICS in the meantime and try to hire some of those limited term positions in the interim to have those funded and on the ground as soon as possible.
And I'll reinforce what Valerie's saying. We have a lot of experience in different efforts. We actually have virulent Newcastle disease going on in the poultry populations in Southern California. So immediate response is paramount to long-term success. And just as a reminder of how this could go, which we hope it doesn't, the Chesapeake Bay project where they eradicated nutria there took almost 20 years. And so that's why you can't say it enough that you have to get on this thing very early and get on top of it because it's a very tough one. And we heard scare stories out of Chesapeake Bay. They had like the freeze of a lifetime that they thought would help them out a lot. And they actually found overwintering nutria populations where they had sacrificial nutria who piled on top of the main population to insulate them from that extreme cold so that they could begin reproducing once it thawed out. I mean, that's how resilient this creature is.
Kevin, that was like just under 20,000 nutria that were killed in Chesapeake Bay, I think, right? Like 17 or 18,000?
14,000.
14.
Yeah, over roughly 15 years.
Yeah, they fought it for a very, very long time. We're hoping we don't have to do it here. And just to illuminate on what CDFA's role in this is we do what's called delimitation survey work. And so we're at the periphery trying to outline where is it. So we work in conjunction with Fish and Wildlife so that we can establish what are those outer boundaries looking like, so that informs their efforts within the boundaries to put their resources where it can do the most good. We hope in the future, we have a little bit of issues with CEQA compliance, but we are hoping that we're working through those so that as this thing moves forward, we can take a more active role in some of the more direct trapping and take of nutria, since we have staff and personnel out there. We also have 2 years of funding right now. This year was the first year, and we have funding for next year to do this delimitation, but we fully anticipate that this is going to go on for a while, so we're prepared to submit another BCP so that we can continue our partnership.
Just a quick question, is trapping the most effective technology?
For removal? Yes. Most often these animals are pretty elusive and active primarily at night. So it is not common for us to see them out in the daytime. Otherwise we would be in a position where we would be required to be spotlighting in habitats that are not conducive.
Well, if there are no other questions, I think I will thank Valerie very much for this update. And thank you to CDFA and Department of Fish and Wildlife and all who are working to eradicate nutria. It sounds like we're going to have a strike force for a while, and perhaps the Dpic agencies could think about how we can help so that you're not moving from BCP to BCP. So we'll think on that. Thank you. With that, I see that we are actually 15 minutes over, so I won't take the time to recap the meeting. Thank you all for joining us today. This was a full, productive meeting. Thank you everyone for taking the time, especially our Washington, D.C. guest, and we'll see you all at the next Dpic meeting.
Thank you.